Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this, the latest in our MHC Built Environment series of webinars. My name is Tom Davy. I'm a partner in the real estate team here in MHC, and today we're going to discuss industrial and logistics real estate, a really interesting subsector of the real estate market, which has undergone considerable change in recent years, as we probably all are aware, and not least as a result of Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the acceleration of e-commerce. We're going to consider recent changes in the market, what some of the key drivers of supply and demand are, and how they have affected the construction, the investment into the financing and operation of logistical and industrial premises. To help us to do that, I'm joined by an expert panel of industry specialists. We will first of all hear from Philip O'Callaghan, Managing Director for UK and Ireland at Mountpark. Mountpark, as many of you will know, is a leading investor in and developer of logistics and industrial property across Ireland, the UK, and indeed Europe. Philip will tell us a little about Mountpark's active projects, including Baldonnel. He'll provide an interesting perspective on the investment side of the market and perhaps a comparison between the Irish market and the UK market. You're very welcome, Philip, and thanks for being with us today. Next, we're going to hear from Laurence Flood, who is a director at Erigo Group, which specializes in bespoke industrial construction and which is active across a number of locations, including Vantage Business Park and Northwest Business Park. Laurence is going to share his perspective on the design and development of logistics and industrial space in Ireland, some of the challenges facing the delivery of such premises, and the relevance of sustainability in the sector. Thanks for joining us today, Laurence. Next, we're going to bring in Treston, who is a director in real estate finance at AIB, which provides senior debt to fund investments across industrial, office, retail, and residential. Derek has financed some large industrial and logistics portfolios, both in Ireland and Europe in recent years, and he'll consider some of the key issues for lenders and where the investment and development finance market is for industrial and logistical premises. Finally, we're going to hear from Marcus Kennedy, who is a partner of mine in the real estate team here in MHC. We advise a number of developers, investors, lenders, and indeed operators in the industrial and logistics sector. And Marcus will speak to some of the practical challenges we encounter when advising on transactions in the sector and how some of the issues we're going to discuss today might be incorporated into the deal and the agreements. After we've heard from each of the panelists, we're going to have a Q&A session. Hopefully you'll see the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to ask questions via that function as we go, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those questions and answer them during the Q&A session. So enough from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Philip O'Callaghan of Mountpark. Over to you, Philip, if you're ready.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm Philip O'Callaghan. I'm the Managing Director of Mountpark for the UK and Ireland region. In the next few minutes, I'm going to touch on a bit of background from Mountpark, both in Europe and specifically in Ireland, where we see the impact of e-commerce, COVID and Brexit on the Irish industrial and logistics market, touch on the evolving ESG green agenda for development and investment, specifically again with Ireland, and then just mention what we believe the prospects for the market is over the next 24 months. So in respect of Mountpark, we're a relatively young company, but packed with experience. We were formed in 2014 as a pan-European investment and development platform. The idea behind setting us up originally was to capitalize on the growth of e-commerce across Europe and shoppers changing patterns. Fair to say that since 2014, we're happy with the results and happy to be in that market. Mountpark is backed by USAA, who are a 200 billion US based company, and specifically their real estate arm, and it was with them that we formed a joint venture in 2014. We cover 3 Europes across Europe, UK and Ireland, Western Europe, which is predominantly Spain and France for us, and Central Europe, where we're developing in the Czech Republic, Poland and Slovakia. It's fair to say that across Europe, we are experiencing unprecedented demand for new industrial and logistics units. Never seen anything like it before. And this is translating into rental growth and yield compression. In the UK and Ireland, I'm very pleased to say that at the moment we're on site building 3.5 million square feet of logistics and industrial development. And just touching on a couple of significant transactions that have made some press recently. In Madrid, we built speculatively the largest ever building in Spain, 1 million square feet, which we let within 3 months of PC to a Spanish conglomerate. And then recently we completed the sale of a 540 million euro pan-European portfolio of industrial and logistics units, taking advantage of very significant yield compression, but also to recycle some of that capital into our very significant 1.5 billion European development portfolio. So in Ireland, I believe that we are a significant investor and developer. With what we have committed at the moment in Ireland, we are over 200 million euros. We entered the market with the purchase of Mountpark Baldonnel in 2016, and the reasons behind entering the Irish market at that time were low e-commerce penetration in Ireland, low rents, value in the yields that we could buy, and also, and very significantly, to import the Mountpark specification that we were building on a pan-European basis. So 50-metre yards, 40-metre eaves heights, excellent tenant welfare facilities. And lastly, again, we perceived that there was a shortage of larger speculative units being built, and therefore a hole in the market for us to come in and look at building. And to date, again, we're absolutely delighted with the results of our investments in Ireland, and looking forward to doing more business over here. Specifically on Baldonnel in phase 1, we started building speculatively 120,000 square foot unit and let that during construction to United Drug. And at that time, we then pre-let by way of a design and build building a 230,000 square foot unit to Home Store and more. Buoyed by the success there, we bought some more land for phase 2, which is going to comprise a further 1.1 million square feet of development. Very pleased to say that we are back on site now as of the 4th of May, after a 4-month delay because of closures by the Irish government. We are back on site with 870,000 square feet, and I'm very pleased to say that 750,000 square feet of that is pre-let to a mixture of online retailers and Irish retailers. In fact, we've just announced the letting of Unit C in phase 2 to Home Store and more. Moving on to e-commerce, COVID and Brexit, and how we see the impact of that. Both across Europe, very specifically in the UK and Ireland, we see this all being good, very good, in fact, for the industrial and logistics market. Ireland's online spending has significantly lagged both the UK and Europe for a considerable period of time. In 2015 to 2019 in Ireland, we saw a modest increase in online spending as a percentage of total retail spending from 9 to 11% pre-COVID. If you compare this 9 to 11% to the UK, pre-COVID we were at 24%. During lockdown, it's gone up to 35%. It will fall back significantly as people start shopping in the high street. But very significantly ahead of the penetration in Ireland. Ireland has seen significant growth during the pandemic, 11 to 15%, almost 50% in percentage terms. Again, this is likely to fall back, but this is not just people increasing their spending, but a whole new raft of people who've used internet shopping for the first time. So we believe that this change consumers will continue, and that is good for demand for more logistics and industrial properties. Brexit, early signs are again that there will be a significant positive effect on the industrial and logistics market in Ireland, and specifically Dublin. We've seen, looking at Baldonnel, an interest there, interest from both high street and internet retailers who are looking to gain representation or increase footprint in Ireland. We've experienced problems ourselves in customs just importing things, and I think people are going to play safe and try and onshore. We also, in respect of ESG green agenda and the effect that this is going to have on the future design of our buildings, increasingly, in addition to the operational requirements of our tenants, there is the influence of investors like ourselves and others in the market, tenants and government requirements to make buildings more sustainable, and we see this being reflected in future design, well, currently and in future design. Lastly, our view on prospects for the next 24 months for this sector, we think it's going to be very good. We look forward to finishing at Baldonnel and entering into new developments in and around the Dublin region and perhaps other parts of Ireland. Tom, on that note, I will hand back to you.
That's great, Philip. Thank you very much for that insight. Really great to hear the Mountpark story, what you're doing now, and also to hear that there's scope for plenty more growth in the market in Ireland. So it's certainly positive, and thank you for that. We're going to move over to Laurence Flood of Erigo Group now, and Laurence might speak a little about the evolution of industrial and logistics premises and kind of where we've got to, and of course a little bit about Erigo Group and what they're doing. Over to you, Laurence. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. As you've heard, my name is Laurence Flood. I'm a director of the Erigo Group. We are a family-owned and run group of industrial development and construction companies, and we're based in North County Dublin. Our family have been building industrial and logistics buildings in Dublin for coming on 25 years now. In that time, we have worked on everything from agricultural sheds and aircraft hangars to logistics buildings and all the way up to heavily fitted out tech and pharma buildings. Our latest project is Vantage Business Park, an all new 30-acre development we are working on at cold winters on the M2 in Dublin. We firmly believe that Vantage Business Park is one of the best located logistics parks in the country, given how close we are to the M50, Dublin Airport and the Dublin Port Tunnel. Unit 2 is a 65,000 square foot facility that was sold to NPP, an Irish packaging company, and completed last year. We are just about to go out on site, fingers crossed, with Unit 1, a 46,000 square foot unit, We're also due a final grant of planning this week for phase 2 of the development, which will be a further 250,000 square foot of space across 3 buildings. There will be a third and final phase to follow, with approximately another 100,000 square foot heading into design probably in the next 12 months. We are investing heavily in local infrastructure with major upgrades to roads and drainage in the cold winters area, along with all new footpaths and bike tracks to be built. These local upgrades are possible due to a long-standing good relationship with the local authority here, Fingal County Council, and a recognition that our next few years on site is an opportunity to enhance the area for our neighbours and tenants alike. Our main focus in recent years has been on logistics buildings, as the demand in that corner of the market continues to grow. We are always very client focused, and where possible we'll look to involve an owner or tenant in the design process. That design process has evolved over the years as buildings get more complex and sophisticated. This is largely due to growing needs of occupiers and growing expectations of investors. We have seen a huge shift in the buyers of these buildings from owner-occupiers in the 90s and mid-2000s to today, where investors are now the primary buyers of new stock, whether that's empty sheds or fully let ones. That shift in ownership has been reflected in the design of buildings that are effectively getting taller and bigger to fit more pallets in, and also more sustainable in line with ESG standards. But even while building designs evolve, what remains is the process. An area that personally I am particularly focused on is the design and planning stage. It is a crucial part of the process, and it starts with appointing the best design team available. Its importance simply cannot be overstated. It can be the difference between a good, clean permission and a very difficult one. For us, it is simple. Our design team must have logistics building design experience. The team we assembled for the Vantage project have huge experience in this sector, and this has been borne out by our steady progress through design and planning in recent months. I'd like to finish up by discussing sustainability, as touched on earlier, as it is becoming an increasingly important consideration in designing these buildings. In a very short period of time, sustainability has become a core element of our design strategy. And I see that becoming standard in an industry that was still resistant to it only 2 or 3 years ago. We are seeing more and more industrial buildings targeting LEED certification, as we will be doing ourselves with our next build here at Vantage. Some developers have even opted for both LEED and BREEAM. We are behind the curve here, certainly compared to the UK market, but what I see as a positive is that most of the industrial developers are now fully engaged with delivering more sustainably built buildings. I can see a point in the near future where all new commercially developed industrial buildings carry a reasonable level of sustainability certification, be it LEED or BREEAM. You could, of course, be cynical and look on it as a box-ticking exercise, or you could take the view that you are playing a small part in a better environment for everyone. On that hopefully positive note, I thank you for your time, and I will hand you back to Tom.
That's great, Laurence. Thank you for that. And I think, look, we'll probably touch a little bit later on the points around infrastructure and on sustainability. There's some sort of common themes there, certainly on the green agenda. So we'll loop back to that. Thanks, Laurence. We're going to bring in Derek Treston now of AIB Real Estate Finance for, I suppose, the perspective of a lender here, and a slightly different angle maybe on the sector. So over to you, Derek, if you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not on mute there. Thanks, Tom. So look, just by way of background, AIB Real Estate Finance is a specialist lending unit consisting of over 50 lenders, surveyors, engineers, and economists. I'm a director on the CRE investment side of the unit. We basically provide senior debt to the core CRE sectors, such as office, retail, multifamily PRS, and logistics. Our focus is primarily in Ireland, and our minimum loan amounts are generally 10 million plus. We do have a London team that covers the UK, and from our Dublin office, we also look at small participations in larger European syndicated transactions. Our development team in real estate finance are active in each of the commercial sectors as well throughout Ireland, and also in the residential development space. In terms of our recent experience in the logistics sector, we are very active. We funded a number of transactions over the last 2 to 3 years for some institutional clients, including some large portfolios, one north of 50 million lending, secured by a portfolio of assets located throughout Ireland. Another larger portfolio north of 100 million lending, secured by mainly Dublin-based assets. We've supported other clients on a slightly smaller scale with one-off financings, or gradually building up portfolios of logistics assets. And these have mainly been in the Dublin and Greater Dublin area. Recently, we've also been involved in large-scale European financing of 18 newly developed logistics assets across Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and Czech Republic. And this was financed by a syndicate of banks. AIB took a small participation in the overall debt size, which was north of 500 million. And this gave us a good overview and experience of the sector on a European-wide basis. So it's been very useful for us. Generally, the performance of the logistics assets and portfolios in Ireland that we've seen have been very robust, particularly during the COVID pandemic. Strong demand for space and high occupancies have been maintained. In a lot of instances, any vacancies that we are seeing are strategic or being held back for refurbishment purposes. Rent collections have held up very well throughout 2020, with averages of 90% plus collection rates evident across a number of our schemes and loans. And this has been really positive, and I suppose that demonstrates the strength of the market at present. As people may or may not know, I suppose, look, this has resulted in prime rents across Dublin increasing over the course of 2020 to about €113 per square metre. So that's an increase of about 3% over 2020, compared with a European average increase of around 1.9%. And further increases are expected over the course of the next 12 months. Similarly, there's continued downward pressure on yields in some markets across Europe. Dublin yields, for example, contracted by about 50 basis points to around kind of a 425, 450 range. This is mainly as a result, I suppose, of the weight of capital targeting the sector. In AIB, we're seeing good demand for assets in the sector, and a number of new entrants have entered the market over the last couple of years. However, the main issue we're seeing is a lack of available product to build the portfolios of scale. There's also a scarcity of new build stock available for some larger tenants in particular. At present, I think that there's about probably 4 to 5 main institutional investors that hold large portfolios throughout Ireland, and each have different strategies, so medium-term holds, refurbishing existing stock, or developing out new assets on land holdings within their portfolio. As I mentioned, AIB, we're active lending in this space. Our key considerations include the sponsor track record, the asset management team and their experience, the quality, the location, profile, and the age of the assets, the income risk profile, the sustainability of the rents, and the tenant and covenant strength. And then, importantly, the business plans with regards kind of capex and energy ratings of the assets. In general terms, we probably have a preference for logistics portfolios as opposed to one-off asset financings. There's obviously more portfolio benefits with regards to diversification of the assets and the tenants, which improves the risk profile of the financing. When financing one-off assets, we've a greater focus on tenant covenant and the quality and profile of the asset. And the assets are in this space, I suppose, are mainly new build assets. In relation to development finance, same key considerations apply, but I suppose also include like the developer and the contractor track record, construction budgets, etc. And importantly, the evidence of a pre-letting agreement in place, which is a key requirement for underwriting and debt structuring purposes. So hopefully that gives a quick overview or a snapshot of our activity in the market and what we're kind of seeing on the ground. So I'll hand it back to you, Tom. Thank you.
That's great, Derek. Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear the sort of lender perspective, the AIB perspective. Marcus, we're going to bring you in now, if that's all right, maybe to consider some of the sort of transactional issues that arise, some of which will overlap around some of the comments we've heard already. But we'll pass to you for now.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. So, traditionally, Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. So, traditionally, development of industrial and logistics assets were delivered to owner-occupiers, which were intended for owner-occupiers, tended to be straightforward by comparison to, say, mixed use. However, with increased investor interest can come increased complexity in the transactional terms. So, in addition to the usual fundamentals such as title and planning services, comes increasing sophistication in relation to development agreements and JVs by landowners and developers to deliver new stock. So I'll briefly pick up on three of the common threads touched upon by the other panelists. Firstly, COVID, then ESG, and finally planning, and their current transactional relevance. So, dealing firstly with COVID, obviously this has been hugely impactful to works programs due to the closures of construction sites, and with the related costs to developers for failure to deliver PC by a target date, or sometimes even by a long stop date. So this has manifested itself in the context of development agreements and agreements for lease, where there's been increased scrutiny on the concept of force majeure, which is a term commonly relied upon by a developer for an extension of time. No statutory definition of force majeure, so it needs to be agreed in each transaction. And it's not uncommon now to see that the definition of force majeure expanded to include a public health emergency or pandemic, and consequently to entitle a developer to an extension of time due to COVID-related delays. And I think it seems likely that there'll be a similar treatment of force majeure going forward into the future, even when we have seen the back of COVID. Then moving on to ESG, and I just firstly like to mention that the next MHC webinar in our Built Environment series will focus exclusively on this subject. And as the other panelists have mentioned, ESG, or to give it its full name, environmental, social, and corporate governance, is a prevalent theme across both the investor and occupier market. And it's a relatively new concept, really introduced in the last, say, 24 months or so, and it's now being negotiated into the preparation of development agreements and agreements for lease. So the reality is most investors and tenants now have ESG policy documents which inform the nature of the property they will transact on. And in terms of the legals, this can translate through to, for example, an outright obligation on a developer to deliver a minimum standard of building energy rating or minimum LEED standards or BREEAM standard or certification. In managed estates, we're seeing the introduction of obligations on the parts of landlords, management companies to implement energy management plans and maintain environmental performance data with the cost being recovered in the usual way through the service charge. In the context of occupational leases, tenants' works and alterations covenants are also impacted, and we're seeing leases include an entitlement on the part of a landlord to refuse consent for tenants' works or alterations where those works are of such a nature as to adversely impact the environmental performance of the building. And we're also seeing specific obligations imposed on the part of a tenant to comply with any LEED practice or BREEAM practice or requirements so as to maintain the relevant LEED or BREEAM standard granted to the building. Then finally on planning, in the context of the acquisition of a site for a new build by a land sale contract, we're often seeing these as conditional upon a purchaser obtaining a satisfactory planning permission. This can be conditional upon rezoning, but more commonly we see it relating to planning permission for what the parties agree to be a satisfactory planning permission, which is typically a defined term and might mean, for example, a 75,000 square foot industrial building with ancillary office use, and which is not subject to onerous conditions. An onerous condition can be, the most heavily negotiated concept in planning conditions. And in very general terms, is any unfavorable condition in the grant, which entitles the purchaser to pull the plug and walk away. Again, it's very deal specific, but it could include things such as unexpected financial conditions, a material effect on the cost of the construction works, or imposing a condition which is restrictive of use. An obligation is then typically placed on the purchaser or the vendor, but it's more typically the purchaser, to procure a satisfactory planning permission by a long stop date. And if that's not achieved by that long stop date, both parties walk away. So that's a very brisk overview of some of the current transactional issues or trends that we're seeing. And it's a sector which is evolving at pace at the moment from the perspective of investors, developers, and occupiers alike. With that, I'll hand it back over to Tom.
That's great, Marcus. Thank you. Clearly, a more complicated transaction maybe than the traditional industrial transactions of some years ago. We've a number of questions in, and we'll try and work through those as we go. I think the ESG and sustainability, the relevance of it is fairly obvious here. So we might just start there if that's okay. And one of the questions I'd had in mind was around, and I might direct it to you, Philip, if that's okay, as to whether further government or state intervention in Ireland is maybe required or recommended as regards sort of compliance with ESG and sustainability, and whether we're sort of catching up, shall we say, with other jurisdictions like the UK, or is it the case that the market demands it anyway? I think Laurence touched on most investors and occupiers will insist on it anyway. Any views on that, Philip?
Yes, thanks, Tom. I think it's inevitable as governments around the world, including the Irish government, set targets in terms of carbon neutrality and sustainability and the years that they're directing those towards. To achieve those targets, that they're going to have to intervene and direct people in all sectors, including the industrial and logistics development market and investment market, to look at the buildings and to help them achieve those targets. And you quite rightly say that investors, developers, tenants, etc., all have their own agendas and are all demanding better buildings from a sustainable carbon neutrality point of view. So I think it's a combination of all of them, but I do think governments are going to have to get involved significantly. And for example, industrial and logistics buildings, they provide a great opportunity because they have great expanses of roof space. We typically in the UK now on our speculative buildings are providing at our cost PVs on the roofs, providing about 50% of the energy that's necessary, plus batteries within the units to store any energy that's been created and not used by the tenant, but these are 24/7 operations, so they use it during the night. So I think it's going to be a combination of all of them, but without doubt, governments are going to have to enforce that, and I think it'll level up the playing field for developers, definitely, in terms of, you know, if you know what you have to do and what you have to provide. That will be a cost to the building, and you know, if everybody's doing it, then we're all working off a level playing field.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Philip. And Laurence, I suppose a similar or kind of related question, given the sort of increased spec, if I can, you know, call it that, in buildings in the sector, you know, what are maybe some of the things that are going into these buildings to deal with that increased spec? Be they sort of, you know, sustainability focused, or just as a result of the sheer scale, you know, the fact that the size of these buildings is getting so much bigger?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a good question. I think there's different strands to it, really. It's not just a sustainability question. I think, as I touched on, you know, as the demands from the occupiers get more and more sophisticated, these buildings quite simply are getting bigger. If you look at, you know, the previous development cycle, typical sizes for these buildings around Dublin range from 20 to 100,000 square foot. Look at any of the planning applications that are currently working their way through, or any of the sites that are going live, and more you're seeing buildings above the 100,000 square foot range and heading up into the hundreds of thousands of square feet, which really is unheard of in this country. So the buildings are getting bigger, the buildings are getting taller, and that is going to have a knock-on effect on some of the more practical things, like we touched on before, in terms of floor finishes, how these buildings are actually built. On the sustainability side of things, of course, you know, you're looking at, as Philip mentioned, PV panels is going to become more prevalent. It's not something we've done ourselves to date. It's something that we may look at in the future. But I think, you know, EV charging and HGV charging are going to become standard in these buildings, and, you know, providing the capacity to extend EV charging in the buildings is important. So looking at how you're bringing your power supply into the building, whether you're bringing in medium voltage or low voltage power supplies, these are things that you can look at design stage. And I suppose these are things that really need to be thought carefully about at design stage, because, as Philip will know, there's no point really with some of this stuff trying to retrofit it at a later date. The earlier you can start thinking about these things, build them into your design and your strategy, the better.
Great, thanks, Laurence. Derek, sticking with the sort of ESG theme for a minute, what's the relevance of it to lenders like AIB?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's really important at the moment for AIB and for most of the lenders out there. I mean, I'll take this as an opportunity for a shameless plug, if you don't mind, but you may have seen the press release yesterday in relation to AIB's green bond issuance. Basically, AIB raised 750 million after completing its second green bond issuance in less than a year. It followed last September's 1 billion issuance, which was the first green bond issued by an Irish bank. But I mean, this helps us back a number of green initiatives, including top-rated energy efficient and low carbon kind of assets, you know, which can also apply to the logistics sector. You know, it allows us to offer improved pricing to the market for green logistics assets, and you know, we've utilized it to date on a couple of projects, and you know, we're currently in discussions on a few more where, you know, they are kind of green assets, and you know, because of the ESG credentials of them, you know, we're able to offer improved terms out there. So you know, it's very important for AIB, and to be fair, very important for investors and tenants alike.
Great, thanks, Derek. We've a couple of questions in which I might try and kind of collate. And Philip, you spoke about, you know, Mountpark and its decision to sort of invest in or come into Ireland. You know, we've a series of questions here around the sort of scalability, what are the key drivers of demand? Clearly, demand is far outstripping supply as at the moment. And sort of, how far is the Irish market off that sort of that balance being reached? Does that make sense?
It does. How I define when it's going to reach that point is very difficult. Look, I mean, we were set up, as I say, in 2014 to take advantage of people's changes in shopping patterns. That's what underpins this for us. And the people are changing the shopping patterns. Ireland is, unless people in Ireland are different to people in terms of their shopping, etc., and the convenience that they want of shopping, and certainly younger generation coming through, then why won't that increase to the levels that we're seeing in the UK and continental Europe? I can't see any reason why it won't. So, that on that basis alone, without being too analytical, a doubling in demand from consumers will relate to a huge increase in demand for new logistics warehouse space. So, yes, you've got to take on board that the Irish market is much smaller in terms of population compared to where I mentioned before. But at this moment, we are very keen to get new opportunities in especially the Dublin region. We see this staying strong for an indefinite period of time. I can't say what indefinite is, but you asked about 24 months. We see it going beyond 24 months and remaining very positive.
Right. Yeah. Certainly some distance to go there. I have to say I'm kind of surprised at the levels of e-commerce penetration in Ireland. It certainly seems that there's ought to be more of that, given the volume of sort of deliveries, certainly to my house and neighbours as we all work from home. But quite some distance to go, it would seem there.
Tom, if I could just add to that, actually, I mean, I think other factors that we need to consider, and Philip makes some very good points. But if you look at our recent history here in this country, from 2009 to 2017, there was little or no new industrial stock built in this country. I could probably count on one hand the amount of new buildings built in Dublin in that time period. So the end result of that is vacancy levels now for new stock at an all-time low. Second-hand stock cannot be got. You talk to the industrial agents around town, and their stock levels in second-hand stock are at an all-time low. So all these things are contributing to the surge you're seeing at the minute, with guys like Mountpark and ourselves and any other industrial developers around town are all trying to get out on site if they're not out there already, and all have active planning permissions working their way through the system.
Yeah, look, fair point, absolutely, Laurence. And I suppose, like, to stick in on that, Laurence, like, clearly everyone would like things to happen faster. What are sort of some of the challenges here? And I'm thinking, you touched on infrastructure earlier and contribution to the community and improving, the area generally, but by way of development. I think we can probably say, Ireland in terms of road network, for example, is very strong, and you spoke about connectivity to the main routes and so on. What about connecting services and the like to sites? Have you sort of a generally positive experience there, or are there challenges that you could be sort of overcome or dealt with better?
Yeah, generally positive, I would say, Tom. I mean, we have had some issues. I don't know if there's anyone from Irish Water, ESB in the audience there, but we have had some issues. I mean, we last year, I guess it didn't help. Obviously with pandemic, and we were trying to get, for example, some ESB connections into new buildings, and we struggled. Irish Water got a lot of bad press, to be fair to them. We worked quite well with them last year, I have to say. But I think what you'll find is on any of these schemes now, developers are, at increasingly earlier stages, are getting their applications into Irish Water and needs to be really, once you've got a grant of planning permission, I would be of the opinion that you should be putting those applications in immediately, because they do take time now to work through the system. So I mean, by and large, like no major negative issues, but they are very busy, particularly ESB, and they're possibly overworked in some areas of the country. Particularly given the amount of data centers that we're seeing at the minute, it's putting a big strain on their capacity. Again, I go back to the points I made earlier in terms of design team. It helps when you have an experienced design team who's used to putting these designs and applications together in ways that will, facilitate their passage through the process in a timely fashion.
Yeah, great, Laurence. Yeah, and understood. Marcus, a question for you, if I can, around tenants and operators of industrial and logistics premises. We've clearly heard a lot of the upside here, and perhaps it's less common in the sector than for concessions to be offered or agreed with tenants through over the last sort of 12 months, 14-month period. Are you seeing concessions agreed with tenants in the sector? And if so, what sort of arrangements are being agreed?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when we think of, COVID kind of enforced negotiations relating to rent concessions, they've focused more, for obvious reasons, heavily on other sectors, retail and hospitality are two that spring to mind. The industrial sector, based on our experience, has been more resilient, and that's due to the reasons that the other panelists have discussed. And notwithstanding that, I'd say that we have seen industrial tenants approach landlords for concessions, and they can take. The mechanism for those can be rent concessions or abatements or rent deferrals, and can be rent-free periods. It can be kicking tenant break options further out, or introducing landlord breaks. I suppose, like a lot of these things, a lot depends on the industry in which the tenant is operating. If you think. Think of a builder supplier, for example, their trade is likely to have been, their business is likely to have been negatively impacted by COVID-related closures of construction sites. Whereas online retailers, as the others have mentioned, have probably not suffered to the same extent, So it is minimal, but we have seen it. And also in relation to, granting of new leases to tenants, that we won industrial units where we were acting for a landlord, where the tenant had sought to introduce a clause into the lease whereby there was a rental payment suspension in the event of the government introducing a mandatory measure restricting use of the property. Now, obviously, whether that would be accepted is on a case-by-case basis, and as I say, it's very much dependent on what market the tenant operates in.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Philip, I had another question for you, if that's okay, just around, we've spoken about the serious change in the nature of industrial and logistics premises over, even maybe over the last 5 years. And one of the things I've noticed in recent schemes, and including Mountpark schemes, is provision for sort of amenity and facilities around in a sort of maybe campus sort of setting, and that's something certainly I hadn't seen before, at least not in Ireland. Any thoughts on, or maybe share your thoughts with us about what are the drivers of that? What makes that become really relevant in what traditionally would have been a picnic table, maybe, and an ashtray, for on the side of a yard.
So I think you're talking back to the days where warehouses had 2 employees, one lady in the office and a guy operating the forklift truck. Yeah, look, I mean, employee welfare and actually what you touched on before, services and power, but the provision of power in the UK are two of the main drivers of occupational demand. We've got low unemployment in the UK, and more, especially from the bigger warehouses and the bigger employers. Their locational requirements have been dictated as much by the availability of employment as by the availability of a highway network, etc. And therefore more and more is going into attracting those employees. So if they're going into a new area where there's a lot of warehouse employees already, and then once they get them, retaining them, there is great demand for good warehouse operatives, office managers, etc. In the UK. So we are now having to provide almost a standard, either on a spec building or working with the tenant on a design and build, lots of things that you would never have seen before in a warehouse. Canteens and gyms, trim trails on the bigger developments where we were able to put running trim trails, etc. Absolutely breakout areas for the tenants so that they can go and have a bit of time off and not be sort of just shoved into a dark corner somewhere. Some of our buildings now, especially in the UK, Spain, etc., we're using the areas above the offices to provide roof terraces for when the weather is better. So those employees need to feel, because of the demand for those employees, these employees need to feel wanted. They need to feel that their employers are providing for them. So it's a massive issue in the UK, and one that I believe will also become very relevant in Ireland. We are, as I say, down at Baldon already providing those facilities. But yeah, as demand for warehousing gets more, then demand for warehousing employees, operatives will get more, and things like employee welfare will go right to the top of the agenda.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and a real shift in focus, I think, and no doubt we're going to see more of that. I'm conscious of time, so I'm conscious also that there are some further questions in that we maybe haven't got to, and we'll do our best to answer those maybe after the event. So it really just leaves it to me to thank our panelists for really interesting insights there on the sort of evolution of the real estate in this sector, the move to larger scale, more sophisticated, and a greater focus on technology and greater focus on sustainability, and as Philip has just touched on sort of employee retention and employee welfare. Certainly, from a commercial perspective, it seems that the sector and investment in industrial logistics real estate has, it'll continue to grow beyond COVID-19 and as the sort of initial shock from Brexit and the disruptions ease. So thank you very much to the panelists, Philip, Laurence, Derek and Marcus. Thanks for being with us, as we say. My thanks also to our events team for all the preparation for today. And thanks to everyone who has logged in today to the webinar. We very much hope you found it interesting and useful. And please let us know what you think and indeed, I suppose, what other topics and subjects you might like to be covered, like webinars like this. So if you can complete, there's a short survey that pops up just as you log out of Zoom. Please do complete that. Let us know what you think and let us know what you would like to hear on in subsequent webinars. Otherwise, thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.